I want to do a bonus lecture on one of my favorite chapters in history, and it's a really fascinating story because Japan is the only country to do this. And it's about how Japan is able to resist imperialism from Europe. And it's the story of something called the Meiji Restoration. Now, this story starts, and some of this we already know. We read a couple of weeks ago. So you have the Tokugawa shogunate, where they're ruled by a military dictator, but really the emperors have very little power. And Tokugawa unifies the country, moves the capital to Edo, and he establishes this feudal system where the daimyo, controls everything. Where the shogun controls everything, and the daimyo, in exchange for land and power, are their nobles. Now, this is the sort of Japanese feudal period. What's interesting with this, if you look at it, this shows you the different prefectures of Japan and how divided they were. But then if you look at the Japanese feudal pyramid, what's a little different is they really didn't like merchants and artisans, and they were at the bottom, whereas peasants were a little bit above that. And then Ronin, of course, were your like masterless samurai. Samurai kind of are like knights. And then you have the nobles, the shogun, and the emperor. So that, I just find their feudal pyramid a little bit different. There's a picture of Tokugawa, quite a handsome gentleman. Now, as we read about a couple weeks ago, Japan isolates itself in response to Christian missionaries, only let, the Dutch merchants in Nagasaki. And really, for those 200 years, Japan is cut off from the outside world. They isolate themselves, but they do have this flowering of culture. But where this all leaves them is by the mid-1800s. Yes, they're sort of vaguely aware of what's going on around the modern, not really part of it. They're just kind of their own thing. And so that is really interesting. We haven't had a society, that cut off. So to really understand China is, and we talked about this in the earlier lecture, is just what had been happening to China to understand Japan. So they were the 300-pound gorilla of Asia. And Japan knew they were not as strong as China, at least at this time period. And they watched as China got carved up by the Europeans, the Opium Wars, the spheres of influence, etc. So, and again, we talked about the Opium Wars in the last lecture, so not really going to dwell on that too much here, but obviously it's humiliating for China. Now, this is our situation. So Japan is still isolated in 1853. Now, the U.S., in the typical arrogance of a Western power, decide that they want to trade. And so in 1853, it's really the most consequential thing President Millard Fillmore ever does. And like no Americans ever heard of Millard Fillmore. He sends this guy, Commodore Perry, you can see his actual picture here, over to Japan and basically sails into Tokyo Bay and says, knock, knock, we're here, trade with us. Now, the Japanese have not really seen steamships, not really seen cannons. And he basically tells the Japanese he wants to negotiate. The Japanese first response is, no, we're isolationists. So he then tells his squadron to blow up this abandoned Japanese hut, sails away, says, I'm coming back in 6 months. So here's the challenge for Japan. What do you do? Now, what's interesting here is some use of primary sources. These are Japanese drawings of Commodore Perry. Now, whatever you can say, he didn't look like that. He looked like that. And then there's his ship. It looks like something out of a Disney cartoon. All you need is Ursula from The Little Mermaid here. Now, what do you do? So the Japanese shoguns are facing this really tough challenge because they really, when he returns, they have no choice but to open up with trade. So here's a little picture of the ceremony. But their entire way of life is at risk. So their choice facing the country is, how do you preserve Japan's independence? What do you do? Do you fight and lose, or do you find some other way to do this? So that is where Japan departs from other models. So here you can see the ceremony of signing the treaty. It's the Treaty of Yokohama. And years ago, I went to actually a museum in Tokyo or Yokohama. They have about this treaty. So you can see the Civil War kind of outfits with the samurai. So what ultimately happens is the shogun wants to fight, and it's like better to go down, be noble. But these younger samurai oppose this, and they want to modernize Japan. So starting in 1853, you have this civil war. Goes on for 15 years. But by 1868, they actually win, and they depose the shogun, and Tokugawa dynasty's done. And they restore, they put back on in real power, sort of, this Emperor Meiji. And so this is called the Meiji Restoration. And there is the Emperor Meiji. Now, what does this mean? So the Japanese begin to modernize, and they modernize fast, and it comes from the top. So they don't care. Anybody from the West that knows about modern technology is brought to Japan to show them how. So government, education, transportation, the military, and fashion were just some areas that change. And within 25 years, Japan goes from like a feudal, like the Middle Ages country to, in effect, like Victorian England. And if you go, you can see museums on this stuff. It's really fascinating. Now, a good movie that we'll watch the trailer for in just a second. It's called The Last Samurai with Tom Cruise. And it is basically, he's a Civil War guy who goes. And in that movie, the heroes are the old people who want to hold on to the old ways, but that's not what happened. So you can just see here, look at the difference. It, goes from one to the other. So here is some examples. They modernize, and you can see their troops. And you can see here, this is a picture of the first delegation to come to Washington, D.C., like in the 1850s. So here you got the samurai with the Lincoln top hats. Just a little nuts. Again, here you go, this modernization. Now, because they're copying everything Western, even today, this is a picture I took years ago of a Japanese mailbox. You still see English in weird places. That's basically a British-style mailbox. And it says post with all the Japanese. And here's a train station, about 1900.
Japan's got it in mind to hire experts to train their army.
We will pay you $400 a month.
5. How many other genuine heroes you got lined up?
Company, form a battle line on me! Assume firing position!
What do you want?
To know my enemy.
I've seen what you do to your enemies. What do you want from me?
What do you want for yourself?
Now, this shows a picture of Emperor's Procession about 1890. There's Edo Castle, which is still there, looks just like that. But here you've got kind of this Western stagecoach, these Western style outfits, and you still see that in Japan. Now, there's a dark side, though. This sounds like this amazing story, but Japan figures, well, if we're going to get Western, we're going to take the good with the bad. And that means racism, the scientific racism, imperialism. So after modernizing, they take over Korea. And in 1894, they defeat Russia. And then there's the Russo-Japanese War, which ends in Japanese victory. And this is the first time a non-European country defeats a European power. And actually, the Western countries, including us, freak out. Teddy Roosevelt actually mediates a end to this war because he does not want Japan to get the entire victory. And actually, he wins the Nobel Peace Prize for that. Back in Europe, actually, the defeat in this war causes some uprising in Russia. They have some revolts in 1905. And then this actually eventually helps bring on the Russian Revolution. Now, the other dark side of this is Japan becomes convinced that they are superior. They have this right to expand, and they buy into all those ideas of racism. They're better than the Chinese and the Vietnamese and the Koreans, because why couldn't they resist this? So when you get into World War II, Japanese are fulfilling this like U.S. idea of manifest destiny, and they do some horrible atrocities in China, in Korea, because they view the Japanese or they view those other countries as subhuman. Now, what are the legacies of this? Well, if you ever go to Japan, I don't know if any of you have been, it's this fascinating country. You'll see this if the Olympics happen, where it's still this mix of old and new. And they love their gadgets, they love their technology, but there's a respect for older things. Years ago, on my first trip to Japan in 2000, my enduring image of it was this lady in a kimono with these wooden sandals talking on a cell phone as she got on the subway. And that is just Japan. Here you can see a picture of Tokyo where you got Edo Castle next to the skyscrapers. And that is Japan.